afternoon. If you allow me to stand. Has anyone been to Africa in here before? Anyone been to Africa? 1, 2, 3. Okay, which part of Africa? Just one person. Which part of Africa? Just one person. Which part of Africa have you been to? Cape Verde. Okay. That's an island on the western part of Africa, okay? So, anyway, I'm just here to share with you what you already know. And I hope we can engage in a meaningful discussion. So, as introduced, I'm at the University of Pretoria. I'm a director of the Center for the Study of Governance Innovation, and you are all welcome to Pretoria if you want or hope to come to Pretoria anytime. We can host you for your studies, for your research, and everything else. I'm going to say a few things about Africa-EU relations. These are not my opinions. If you want my opinions, you can buy me pizza afterwards, then I can tell you. But I'm just going to share with you what the research says and what policy says in terms of the way Africa-EU relations are, especially from the perspective of African countries. So that's the title of my presentation there, and those are the things that I'm going to talk about, and basically the perceptions of the EU from South Africa, and then Africa-EU relations, and a couple of things under that in terms of the perceptions of the EU. I'll talk about the institutional basis, the EU as a foreign policy actor, and then the impacts of EU policies in Africa. And then hopefully we can discuss after that. So by way of introduction, since most of you say that you haven't been to Africa, that's a map of Africa there. That's the official map of the African Union. I got this from the African Union. That's the way they depict. In terms of land size, just to give you an idea of the mass, for the time being, forget the map that you know about the world. It's not a true map. It's not a true depiction. Because if you look at Africa in comparison to Europe, the land mass, okay, someone mentioned they've been to Cape Verde. It's on the western part. It's an island outside of the land, the continental land mass. But when you tell, in terms of perspective, you can see.
Yes, push that.
So you can see. So this is the whole continent. You can see that the whole of China fits in a bit of southern up to Central Africa. The whole of the Chinese country. The whole of the US fits in Western Africa. And then the whole of India fits in the whole of Africa. The UK fits in the island of Madagascar. And I always, I work with colleagues at KU Leuven in Belgium. I always make fun of them because Belgium fits in a province of South Africa called Western Cape there. Okay, province of South Africa, which has 9 provinces, by the way. So in terms of perspective, you will see that actually the whole of Europe just fits in Central Africa in terms of the landmass. I won't talk about the population because the population of Europe is about 400 million or somewhere there. In Africa, the population is about 1.34 billion. Okay, and it's projected to be twice that by 2050. So you can imagine, some of you maybe are business students, you can start thinking in terms of the market. And by the way, Africa has a rising middle class, so if you are writing any assignments, I'm giving you answers already. Okay, but in terms of the discussion for this lecture, so Africa constitutes the landmass that includes the continental landmass and also the islands like Cape Verde that are around the continent, Madagascar, the Comoros, Seychelles, Mauritius, etc., etc. And then this definition of Africa corresponds with the definition of the African Union. Now, since we are talking about relations with the EU, this is very important. And why, I'll show you on the next slide. The reason is because Africa, in terms of regional integration, there are so many regional economic communities on the African continent, and actually some scholars have called it the spaghetti bowl of regional integration because there are so many. But the African Union recognizes only 8 regional economic communities, which are shown on the map there. Okay, these 8 there. Now, the reason why I say it's important in terms of relations with the European Union is because when the European Union is relating with Africa, it has introduced what is known as the Economic Partnership Agreements. And the way it has structured the Economic Partnership Agreements is not according to the way the African Union perceives regional integration in Africa. So the African Union, for example, says there is the Southern African Development Community, where I come from, which is 16 countries in this part of the continent. Then there are other regional economic communities like the West African Economic Community, the states of, Economic Community of West African States. But when the European Union says it wants to engage with African Union, it splits these regional economic communities and actually says it can only engage with Africa according to the way it wants the regions to be arranged. So already you see there's a problem there. I hope we can come back to that as we continue our discussion. But then, as far as African scholars and African people are concerned, this is the way the European Union perceives Africa. Okay, so Africa is nothing much but a place where resources can be acquired or resources can be exploited, and nothing beyond that. Okay, we can come back to that. I know maybe some of you may find it a bit offensive. By the way, I'm going to show you some stuff in research that you may not be comfortable with, but that's a reality from outside of Europe. It's not European realities. Okay, so relations between Africa and Europe are very complex. First of all, I think we need to acknowledge that. First of all, they are multidimensional, and then also they are very dynamic. There's a lot of history that is involved in terms of the relationship, but one very important thing from an African point of view in the relationship between Africa and Europe is the colonialism and slavery. That one they will never forget until European countries acknowledge. So the problem is that the European countries are not willing to acknowledge that. They say they need to forget about the past. But what we have to bear in mind from an African policymakers, African scholars point of view, is that at the height of the imperial rule in the early 20th century, of course the idea of getting the resources of Africa was central to European countries. And then even after political independence, there were various arrangements. Some of you might have heard of, for example, the Lomé Convention, the Cotonou agreements, and so on and so forth. If you read those agreements, critically read them, you find that at the center of that is the attempt, from the European point of view, is to facilitate market access for African goods into Europe. But from the African point of view, it's the attempt to continue having a hold on African resources in that sense. And there are even scholars who argue that without Africa, the European Union would not have been formed. So the European Union's formation was contingent on exploiting Africa. I'm sure you know from your study of regional integration that one of the motivating factors for integrating Europe was to end the conflict between Germany and France, or the rivalry. But another aspect, which you might not find readily in the literature, is the fact that they wanted to have a common enemy outside of the continent, and that would unite them. Okay, that's an argument by a scholar, especially in, he's in Norway, his name is Johnson. I think I cite him here in the next slide. Okay, so first of all, as I've hinted, for Africans, history matters. It cannot be wished away. It has to be acknowledged. And also, there are scholars and also policymakers who expect European countries to make reparations for colonialism and for the economic deficit of the African continent because of colonialism. Just last week, there was the Commonwealth meeting in Tonga, the island of Samoa. Okay, so there was an agenda that was prepared before the meeting, but at the meeting, all African countries said they don't want the agenda, and then they told instead the British to say, let's consider the issue of slavery and colonialism, and you having to pay back. Okay, it was almost like a surprise. So history matters to them, and the effect of colonialism, that is matters a lot. I'm sure you've read, these are the, you know these names, do you? Does anyone know these names? You are students, you don't know them? Yes. I'll give you an A+ if you are my student. For that. Okay, so these are actually in their work. One of the reason why they won the Nobel Prize is basically integrating colonialism as an institution in economic history. So they do actually say that patterns of economic dependence on former colonizers actually have a consequence in terms of the trajectory of the development of the countries after colonialism up to now. So you even have not building, but related to this argument, there are scholars who say Africa is underdeveloped because of colonialism. And then, of course, there is also the argument that to date, Europe or European countries continue to dominate African countries. Even if colonialism has ended, there's political liberation and freedom. But in terms of economic structures that connect the countries of the world together, the European countries still have a domination over African countries. That's the argument that you find, for example, in this book. And then, of course, there is a continual use of the colonizers' language. Ordinarily, I should not be speaking to you in English. But it's because my country was colonized by the British. And actually that language continues to be the official language in my country, or one of the official languages in my country. We have 12 official languages, including sign language. I don't know if there's any European country that has sign language as an official language. Is there any European country with sign language? Okay, that's something for you to know about an African country. Sign language is official in our country. Anyway, so those are part of the reasons why they can't forget about the past. It has to be acknowledged. So history matters in that sense for African countries. But a takeaway for you is the fact that, because mostly in the engagements between Africa and Europe, the Europeans will say, forget about the past and let's move on. But the African scholars insist to say, what you don't realize is that colonialism actually stripped Africans of their identity. Okay, it's like you are telling a person to say, forget who you are. And after you forget who you are, I want you to assume my identity. I'm not sure if you understand what that means. Okay, so basically annexing the African continent and then stripping the Africans of their humanity and forcing them to assume a new humanity or a new identity. So that's one of the arguments that you are going to find there. But if you come to Pretoria, you go to the government house or the government, the National Assembly, and then you ask the president or the minister of foreign affairs, or you go to any African countries and ask what is the relationship like between Europe and Africa, they will give you all these beautiful things there. Okay, they will tell you that the relations are very healthy and solid. Even when they make their pronouncements, they will tell you we share a healthy relationship. They will tell you that, for example, South Africa or African countries or African Union is a fellow actor with the EU in the global community. They are trying to govern the world, to be a beautiful place, a good place, and so on and so forth. They will say, for example, that they have good and healthy working bilateral relationships. So this is in the context of trying to attract investments on both sides and also to develop markets. Then South Africa and the EU, for example, have a strategic partnerships. For those of you that are studying international relations, you know what that means. And basically, it means that their relationship is stronger than just merely diplomatic. It goes into markets, it goes into economy, and even on security matters. Okay, and then South Africa is also a member of the SADC region. So when it relates with the EU, it also always brings in the fact that it's part of a region. So it relates with the EU in that sense. When they are talking about markets, for example, South Africa tries to prop itself as a gateway to the SADC region. If the EU relates well with South Africa, then South Africa is a gateway to the markets in the region and the continent as well. So that also extends to the African Union. But South Africa is also a member is invited to the G7. So even when it is in those G7 meetings, still it says it's part of Africa, and therefore it brings the whole of the continent to those relationships. It's also a member of the G20. Actually, next year South Africa is going to host the G20 summit. And even in those relationships, it still talks about it's not acting alone, but it has representation, or actually it's somewhat mandated by the rest of the African countries. By the way, does anyone know how many countries are in Africa? I showed you a map. Any idea? Yes, sir. 55. Great, yes. There are 55 countries, okay. So the 1.4 billion people belong to 55 different countries. So it's not only, so Africa is not a country, it's a continent. Please bear that in mind when you think about Africa. But anyway, so G20 next year, South Africa is going to host that, but always it views itself as one of the other African countries when it engages in these meetings. Those are the beautiful things that you're going to hear politicians say when they are in public meetings or gatherings, or when they are on platforms making pronouncements and declarations. But in reality, maybe just first of all to look at the Africa-EU relationship, the institutional basis. I did show you a map of the way Europe perceives Africa. So if you go back to the Treaty of Rome of 1957, there's a clause there which actually talks about Africa. But the way it talks about Africa is in terms of providing market access to goods or preferential treatment of African goods. But if you critically read it, at least the critical literature says, so it says the aim is to provide trade and aid to African countries. But the critical literature says that's not the point. We might come back to that. Then in 2000, the Africa-EU relationship or partnership was promoted into a partnership. So before it was Africa-EU relationship or partnership, but then in 2000 they promoted it to an African Union, European Union partnership. And then the word partnership started to emerge in that relationship, where they were saying that they are partners and it's a partnership of equals and so on and so forth. But that is found in the joint Africa-EU strategy of 2007, and it has three major objectives, which you, I'm sure, are already familiar with: peace and security, human rights and governance, and then trade and regional integration. But what I would like you to note as students is the fact that you see that this trade and aid actually still features in the new partnership, although now the emphasis seems to be on regional integration and less on aid. But still it's the same issue of trade, where preferential treatment is given to African goods. But in addition to that, the EU says it promotes regional integration in Africa. But according to the way the EU defines regional integration, remember the map that I showed you about the regional economic communities on the African continent, but the EU has its own definition of what countries should constitute which regional economic communities, as I said. So that goes there. So basically, the joint Africa-EU strategy outlines those priorities, and then, of course, it claims that it's very committed to developing a partnership of equals between Africa and EU. You read the strategy, you find that written in the strategy. The European Union, we know in Africa that it's a very complex organization, and I'm sure even you know that the European Union is very complex. On the screen there, I've just given two aspects of it just to show how complex it is. Sorry, there's a country there which is not supposed to be there, or which has left the Union. This is an old diagram that I couldn't find one that is not under copyright on the internet. But basically, this gives you some kind of organizational structure with the council, you know, the commission, the committees there, the parliament, and of course the citizens down there. And then this one also gives you, in terms of the various groupings within the EU. And basically the point I'm trying to make here is that it's a very complex establishment, but also it's a complex actor. Because I would like you to think of the EU as an external actor or a global actor. So think of it in terms of an actor that engages with other countries, other organizations, or other civil society, and so on and so forth. So for example, if you go to the UN, you are going to find that the EU goes as a region or a bloc. If you go to any country in the world, at least the majority of the countries in the world, the EU has a delegation, which is basically an embassy. It's almost like a state, a nation-state embassy. So you consider it as an actor in that sense. And even in international affairs, various issues are issues of trade, issues of politics, issues of security, governance. The EU does engage the rest of the actors in the world as one actor. So you think of it in that sense, but if you remember the diagrams that I showed you previously, you realize that first of all, it is multi-structured, it is multi-layered, and it engages in various kinds of activities. The first time I personally came in contact with the EU was when I was very young. I think I was in primary or secondary school. It's just a project that was run by the EU. You know, it was many years ago, before I think all of you before you were born. But at that time, it was not really a global actor, but still it was acting, you know, engaging with countries at a bilateral level. So that's the EU. So despite of this complexity, as an organization, the interesting thing about the EU, at least the way it is perceived from outside, is that it has common positions which represent all the member countries on certain issues that affect the world, and also issues that affect the member countries domestically. So for example, I cite there examples of the common fisheries policy. The EU engages the rest of the world on issues of fisheries. There is a common agricultural policy. The EU deals with member countries or farmers in member countries based on the EU common agricultural policy, but also when it engages, for example, the African Union or African countries, it also uses that instrument as a means of engagement, or at least the terms of reference in that instrument. Then there's also the common foreign and security policy. These policies have impacts on the African continent because the EU, when it engages, for example, it deploys military on the African continent. The military may come from different member countries of the EU, but they come with the badge of the EU, if you have noticed or observed that. Okay, so think of the EU in that sense. As a global actor, therefore, the EU has implications for the way it engages with other countries. It affects other countries or other continents. So, with respect to Africa, the EU actively influences policy formation in Africa. African countries and the African Union. It acts to influence the formation of policies there. That has implications on wealth, as I will show shortly. It has implications on power positions in the Committee of States. Of course, currently there is the issue, for example, of the war in the eastern part of the EU. So that, in terms of power projections, I'm sure the member states of the EU are not only members of NATO, but the EU itself. What do you call the leader of the EU? What do you call? Is it president? The leader of the EU, what do you call? I'm not from Europe, so please tell me. What do you call the person who heads the EU? It's the president. Sorry?
European Commission, but it's not really a president of the traditional sense.
But what do you call them? I mean, what is the official designation? In Africa, the African Union, we call the head the chairperson of the African Union.
Yeah, but in Europe it is a little bit, because you have the president of the European Commission, the president of the European Council, and what else?
Okay, that lady.
The rotating presidency.
Yeah, the lady who is now. What's her title? She's the president of the European Commission.
To some extent, yes.
Okay. Okay, anyway, when she speaks on behalf of the EU, isn't it? So basically she speaks on behalf of all the member countries. So when she says, for example, in terms of the power projection of the EU, they are going to fight or to defend the rights of the sovereign country that has been attacked or invaded. So the EU basically projecting that the EU has a power position in global activities. So that also has impacts on security and so on and so forth. Okay, but impacts with respect to Africa, there are many. I won't talk about all of this, but at least some of the impacts of the impacts of EU policies have an effect in relation to migration. For example, when we talk about EU-Africa relations, there are impacts in terms of agriculture, fisheries, and also the issue of global governance. I've mentioned some of the, at least I've touched on the issue of migration and agriculture. So, for example, the common fisheries policy could be considered as part of, and also the common agricultural policies. So I will say a bit more about this in terms of the impacts. Then, for example, in terms of migration, this is stuff that you already know, being students of international relations in Europe. I'm sure you are familiar with the Schengen Agreement and the Convention of 1990 and what it means. You are familiar with the Single European Act. I think yesterday the speaker, one of the speakers yesterday was talking about the single market. Yes.
Enrico Letta.
Yes, yes, the former Prime Minister of Italy, I think, was talking about the single European market. Then there's a common European asylum system and the Dublin regulations. Now, these ones and these ones, from the way we see them, or people from Africa see them, they are a bit in a crisis mode. These two. I'm not sure. I will hear from you to explain whether it's true. But for example, there's a sense in which countries like Germany want to start, actually maybe it's here, countries like Germany want to start monitoring borders between its neighbors within. So as far as scholars from outside are concerned, I think there is a bit of a shake within the Union. So to say, okay, we are talking about borders, and actually yesterday the former Prime Minister was talking about borders, but there is a threat to say maybe the borders may sort of come back and be reinforced. That had been eliminated. But that's a discussion I'll wait to hear from you to inform me on that one. But those have implications in terms of migration, not only for the EU, but also for third countries like African countries. Just maybe to go a bit in detail. So the impacts of the EU policies can be felt among three groups or categories. So the first group is the ordinary people in African countries. So you will find that what is seen on an African side is that the policies of the EU are very incoherent. Okay, so they may say that they are trying to promote trade. Remember we said promoting trade and aid, or promoting trade and regional integration with Africa. But when they come, the policies actually are not consistent with what the pronouncements that they make. I gave you the example of the economic partnership agreements, where the EU says the only way it is going to engage with the African Union is through regional integration. Well enough, that's acceptable. But then it says, okay, what regions are we going to engage with? It lists the regions. So for example, take the SADC region. Remember the southern part, where I come from. Well enough, that's fair. But then say, which are the members of the SADC that are going to engage in SADC EU Economic Partnership Agreement? Then that's where the problem starts. Because the EU says, no, the SADC does not consist of 18 countries. It only consists of 8 countries. So the other countries do not belong to SADC. Then it removes them and takes them to another region. So that, first of all, basically disrupts the integration in the SADC region, but also it disrupts the plan of the African Union to integrate the continent on the basis of the 8 regional economic communities that I talked about. So that's a problem already with respect to that. So there's the notion, but that has implications on people on the ground. Okay, so we are still talking about people on the ground. So broadly, before we even come to issues of trade, on the notion of migration for people on the ground and the way in which migration is framed. So generally, I know I'm in Italy. I don't know if migration is very sensitive here. I don't know. So please don't throw stones at me if it's sensitive. I'm speaking from outside. I don't know how sensitive it is. But the way the EU is perceived, the way it projects migration, is as if migration, I will show a map shortly, as if migration is a security issue. So basically, the people that are moving from Africa, I don't know about other continents, but the people that are moving from Africa pose a security threat to EU and EU member countries. That's the way they frame migration. And if you have read, for example, Weaver, who talks about basically the notion of securitization. So we have moved from security, speaking about security in the strictest sense, you know, security, hard security, military stuff, but now we begin to securitize other aspects or spheres of life. So the movement of people from one place to another has been securitized. Basically, you are deploying military language and using it for people who are moving up and down. And it becomes a security issue. So once you do that, then you are justified to react to what is happening using security means. So, first of all, migration from Africa to Europe is framed as a security issue. And that would just justify also the way you should respond to it. So you can use, for example, high technology military drones to track migrants. And that is in Europe, which respects human rights. So we are confused in Africa. Okay, but then also the fact that, for example, in 2015, I don't know whether you were already in university or in high school. Where were you in 2015? Were you still? High school. So maybe you were not aware of the migration crisis. Were you aware of the migration crisis, 2015? Yeah, so maybe let me ask you, was that a crisis? Was migration a crisis in 2015? Please be honest with me, I don't know. From here, I don't know. Yes, yes.
In Serbia, it was framed as a crisis because of the migrants using the Western Balkan road. So in the media, it was framed as a crisis.
Okay, that's Serbia. Is it true for, do we have Italians in here?
Yes, there are.
Italians are not speaking. Yes.
So in Italy as well, it was framed as a crisis. The thing is, if you look at numbers, actual numbers, you not considered as a crisis. But then the way in which the EU and all the states, Italy as well, as a state in the Mediterranean, they dealt with it in a very bad way, which created the crisis.
So,
what was how the EU dealt with it?
okay, so basically on the African continent, I mean, you switch on your CNN, you switch on your, I don't know which channel you watch here, but I mean CNN and blah blah blah, those major media, there's a crisis of migration. But in Africa, we go to a country like Uganda, a very small country in East Africa. It has over 1 million refugees from other countries, African countries. And then we say, these people are receiving 1,000 or 20,000 or whatever, and then they say they are in a crisis. But a small, now you might think what I'm saying is ridiculous. Think of it in this way. Uganda, third world country. GDP you can't compare with even Italy. You can't. But it has over 1 million refugees hosting. Then think of Italy. I don't know how many million refugees you have, and then you call that. I mean, even at not even going to a per capita level, you can't compare the two. So anyway, it was called a crisis, but that has to do with the framing. Then that has implications, basically saying because the European Union is facing a crisis, Africans should not come to Europe. That's the implication. There is a crisis here, don't come here. And then there are also economic circumstances that compel Africans to migrate. And mostly these are aggravated by the bad policies of the EU. So the example that I give is the common fisheries policy. So what happens is that the common fisheries policy of the EU has negative impacts on African fishers. Now, I would like you to think in terms of economic and subsistence models. The way they say the Italian economy is structured is totally different from the way, let's say, the economy of Gabon is structured. And the majority of people in Gabon are subsistence farmers, they are subsistence fishers, meaning that they engage in those livelihood activities not for commercial purposes, but just to sustain themselves. Then you have now these big trawlers from Europe that are fishing. They come to the western coast of Africa and they outcompete the small fishers. Remember, they operate in the informal economy. That's their way of operation. They are not commercial. Then they have to compete with these big trawlers. But apart from that, the methods that they use for fishing, they actually violate environmental rules and legislations, even the environmental rules and legislations of the EU itself. But apart from that also, there are subsidies that are given to these fishers. So you give subsidies to your commercial fishers, and yet they have to compete with these small fishers who only fish for subsistence and not to. Apart from that, you engage with a country like Gabon, you allow preferential treatment, you say you allow preferential treatment of their goods to come to Europe, but only on condition that they liberalize their economy. So meaning that they should allow competition from Europe, but they should not subsidize their local companies, their local fishers and everything else. So basically you outcompete the people and you push them out of livelihoods. So livelihoods are destroyed, the environment, fishery stocks are depleted, and the food security of the people who live on those means is destroyed. So that's for the common European fisheries policy. When you look at agriculture also, we have the common agricultural policy, and again, there are subsidies that are given to European farmers. When the EU engages African countries, there's always the insistence on structural adjustment. Restructure your economies. And part of the restructuring of the economy is you should never subsidize any company, whether state-owned or private. So you are saying that to African countries. At the same time, you are busy subsidizing officials. Okay, so that is damaging. So you find that subsidies to European farmers will hurt African farmers, they distort African markets, then also they undercut African farmers, so they can't compete with the European farmers. So what you end up having, if you go to West Africa, for example, it's a pity that most of you haven't been to Africa, but go to a country like Senegal, for example, just walk in any shop, you will rarely find locally produced goods. Most of the goods are from France, Italy, oil brands. Actually, you will think, this is just a province of Italy in terms of products. But that's, if you think about it seriously, basically it speaks to the policies where the farmers can't sell their own products locally because they are outcompeted by products that are coming out of Europe. So the productivity and competitiveness of African farmers is destroyed or affected, and that has impacts on livelihoods. And if you look at literature, like for example, Van Heer and others, they say actually the loss of livelihoods and poor economic conditions may shape and drive migration. Surprise, surprise. Why are Africans coming to Europe? Okay, so the policies have that impact. And actually, maybe I can even use this anecdote from my own research where we were interviewing these guys. This relates to security. And one of the respondents said, whatever happens, I'm going to migrate to Europe. And they said, but why? And then he says, look, they are busy bombing our country. But we know they can't bomb their own countries. So we are going there where we're going to be safe, where they won't bomb themselves. Okay, but these are at the grassroots level in terms of the people. Theory, of course, studies will tell you that it will shape. But let me say one or two things. How much time do we have?
Yeah, we have time.
Do I still have time?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So let me say a few things about migration in Africa. So remember, I showed you the regional economic communities of the continent. So basically, the way these are, so think of the SADC just the way you think of the EU. Although the way they are structured is different from the EU. I mean, the EU is a supranational organization. But when you think of African regionalism, it's not, there's no supranationalism. So think of it in that way. And by the way, for you who are academically inclined, if you are trying to compare EU and African Union or EU and African integration, so it's more or less like you are comparing apples and oranges because the form of integration that they are pursuing is different. So African Union is more of intergovernmentalism. Okay, so there is no, they do have agreements and whatever, but they don't have a supranational organization where they surrender their sovereignty to. They are very, very exact about that. They don't want to surrender their sovereignty to any other organization above the nation state. Okay, that's something. But anyway, so these organizations are supposed together, they will eventually form an African economic community. There is a way in which they've worked it out how it's going to work. So if you think of the SADC, for example, or you think of the ECOWAS here, think of it as similar to the EU, but the form of integration is different, because this one has about 15 or 16 countries, this one has about 16 countries, COMESA spreads up to here, it's about 21 countries and so on and so forth. But each region has a protocol on migration, how they want migration to occur within the region. And then ultimately, the African Union itself has instruments on issues that relate to migration across the whole continent. So those are some of the policies. For example, there's a migration policy framework, which is revised. And basically the way it perceives migration is that migration is important for development. This is contrasted with the securitization approach of the EU to migration. So you already see that even when they are coming to the table to say, let's discuss migration, the EU perceives migration as a security issue. African countries perceive migration as a developmental issue, a development issue. So there's already that difference. Then there's a common position on migration and development, and basically it provides recommendations to African countries on how they should deal with migration. Then there's the AU Convention on specific aspects of refugees. And this is just to show you that the African Union has positions on issues that relate to migration. It has positions and they are very well defined. Some of those positions are very different from the way the EU talks about migration. Now, this map is out of a study that we did a couple of years ago, and basically it depicts migration in Africa. If you switch on your, I don't know what your preferred news channel is, but if you switch on your CNN, at least that's one that we know is common. I don't know if you watch CNN. Which news channels do you watch? Let me not take things for granted. Sorry? Rai. Okay. I don't know if they show anything about migration, but the impression that people from Africa get is that it looks like the whole of Africa wants to come to Europe. That's the impression that is seen on the news. But for your own information, not all Africans are interested in coming to Europe. At all, zero interest. In fact, this data here shows that only about 9.2 million people came to Europe. 9.2 out of 1.3 billion. That's about 3% or less. But if you watch RAI, they will show you that the whole of Africa is coming to Europe. And therefore, that's why they will say they are posing a security threat to Africa. The majority of migration happens within the African continent. About 90% of migration. But also, there is significant migration that goes to North America. So North America or the United States and Canada. And now, increasingly, our research is actually showing that most people are no longer interested in coming to Europe. First of all, even those that come to Europe formally for education and training, for example. UK is even worse now. They are increasingly more interested going east to China, to Australia, and some to Russia. That's what our research is showing. So less to Europe. Okay, but the majority of migration happens within the African continent. And even within the African continent, it happens within those 8 regions that I showed. So there's more migration within the ECOWAS region. There's more migration within the SADC region. There's more migration within the ECAS region, and so on and so forth, about 90%. So when you see the next news item showing people drowning, oh, it's sensitive to Italy. You are on the Mediterranean Sea, right? Ah, sorry. sorry. So it might be sensitive to you, right? Sorry. But the fact is that it's not everybody who's trying to cross that sea to come here. Okay, this is what the data shows. Okay, then, so the issues as far as Africans are concerned with regard to the way the EU projects migration, apart from the boats that you are shown on the Mediterranean Sea of people dying and no, they are not stopping to come, is the fact that first of all, when the EU engages with African countries, it's actually reterritorializing Africa. What I mean by that is that I don't have the map here. I should have included that. Okay, I'll come back to that. Let me just explain these others, then I'll go back to the map that I showed you. So they are questionable bilateral agreements, for example. I think it's Italy. Italy. So yesterday I just learned that actually there are different governments. But for us, when we look, we don't say, oh, this government of A, government of B, government of C. We just say Italy. Okay. So now yesterday, actually, for me, it was a discovery. I even made a note to say, oh, actually, it's specific governments. But the point still remains that the governments or the states here enter into questionable agreements with African countries. An example is Libya. Libya is at war. Libya has a... Is there anybody from Libya before I say it? Okay. So it's a fellow African country. But anyway, Libya has a questionable government that violates human rights. But then the Italian government enters into an agreement with the Libyan government to stop people from migrating. Basically, it gives them money and say, okay, we want you to catch people and stop them from migrating. So the question is, here's a government, or here are countries that claim to be a shining light to the world. They have these values, they have these norms of respecting human rights, freedom of movement and whatever, but they are partnering with a government that violates human rights. How could it be? So that is very questionable. It's basically issues of double standards when you look at it from outside. Yes, sir.
I think it's not only with Libya, but Italy signed the agreement with Tunisia also.
There you are. So even with Tunisia. And actually, within Africa and within the African Union, there have been a couple of issues in the past few years, especially in the campaign leading to the elections in Tunisia, where even the president had a lot of xenophobic statements that he made. And the African Union was like, no. This is not acceptable in the... So you have those agreements, but the agreements will be for aid. Remember the trade and aid that we talked about in the beginning. But the question is, does it really provide aid? Is it really facilitating aid when it is actually inimical to the aspirations of the people? Then there's also the violation of UN protocols and the violation of EU human rights law. This one actually I can even go, you have a European Court of Justice, something like that, right? Mm-hmm. Some of these, Italy has been found guilty on issues of migration actually. Not only Italy, but a number of... then recently, of course, we had that country that has left the EU. It entered into an agreement with another African country to say the processing, they should just... But sadly, there are a number of other EU member countries that are considering that as we speak. Okay, so that is problematic from an African point of view. So there is the issue of double standards, the issue of violation of human rights, and so on and so forth. So actually, the issue of borders, as I said, the EU, what we see is that the EU is pushing, is not only doing that, but it's pushing its borders deeper into Africa. So basically, that's the territorialization that I'm talking about. And then, of course, there it is, actually, that's a news item from Italy to renew 2017 bilateral deal with Libya too. You'll find that on the internet. But going back to the issue of rebordalization that I was talking about, maybe if I go back to, even this will do. So what I don't have the map. There's a particular map that I have in some of my research. This area, if you're familiar with Africa, this area is a desert. Do you know? Yes. Yes, that's the Sahara Desert. So it spreads from West Africa up to here. By the way, Cabo Verde is here. The person that has been to Cape Verde is here. So this desert, remember the framing that we talked about. about securitization of migration. So there is the notion that there are a number of countries here like Chad which are at war. There are countries like Sudan which are at war. There are countries like Somalia and Eritrea which are said to be failed states. You are students of politics, right? Yes, you know what a failed state is. Yes. So there's the narrative of a failed state, where you say the state is not able to function as it is supposed to function. Its structures, its ability to provide security, to provide services have collapsed. So because that state has collapsed, we here and here, we have a moral obligation to go and help that state to develop, to establish itself. But how do we go and help it to establish itself? They send the military to establish peace. And after the military have established peace, they send NGOs to go and put back the structures of the state. So if you come to this region, basically, the notion is that a lot of terrorists come from this region. So the EU, the USA, they have deployed militaries across this region. Okay, although the story is slowly changing, if you are following the news, there are some European countries which are being chased away from those countries. But basically, this whole region, they are military. From here to there, you can draw a straight line. Now, that might sound simple, but the implication is that if you are from this area, you can't move up. You can't cross, or you have difficulties crossing. Why? Because they are saying there are terrorists in this area, and they have put military bases, military personnel, they have deployed them there. So when you are trying to cross, you will encounter the military. That will either stop you from crossing, or they will make you go through all those things that military people do. So in effect, you are restricting the movement of people who are from this region to go up here, within their continent. And effectively, what you have done is you have basically pushed the border. If the border with Europe is here, you have pushed it into the African continent. So basically, you are restricting Africans from moving within their continent. Because you are saying the people here are posing a threat to Europe. That's the impact that some of these policies have. Modern, civilized, human rights, etc., etc. Okay. It even gets ugly. It's in the literature. What is this region called? Anyone? No, the one under the Sahel. What? Sorry? Yes. Sub-Saharan Africa. If you are academics, pay note of concepts. The concept is Sub-Saharan Africa. We might come back to that, but make a note of that. That's the concept. Anyway, so let's continue. Sorry. So the point that I would like to make with regards to migration and the impact on people. First of all, the EU engages with African countries. There are a lot of processes that happen. For example, we have the Rabat process where they deal with issues of migration. We have the Khartoum process, it's issues of migration. There are a lot of them. But those processes have impacts. Actually, there's a research that was conducted by a Dutch research think tank last year, which shows that the war in Sudan, it was not the intention of the EU, but the war in Sudan can partly be blamed on the EU in the sense that before the war started, many years ago, those rapid support forces were used or were given funding in order to try to stop migration of people from Sudan going into Europe. But then they mischanneled those funds. Instead of using the funds for that purpose, they used the funds to arm themselves. So in that way, it contributed to the war. But there are those processes, there are policies, and the realities on the ground. People are affected, and then of course mostly we know as students of international relations and politics that what drives the EU to come up with these policies is because it has its own preferences and its own interests to serve at heart. So you find scholars that will say the EU is not in Africa to help Africa, but it has its own interests. That's why it's engaging in Africa. I'm seeing that people are dozing. I think my voice is a lullaby. Let's just stand and stretch ourselves just for 2-3 minutes. Please, if you need a short break, bathroom. Do you need bathroom? You don't need bathroom. Okay. All right. So that's the view that I showed you from the perspective of people on the ground. But now I would like you to listen to the views of the policy makers. I won't say anything. I won't try to interpret. I'll show you the view. For example, this is the president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa. He was in a meeting. I'll play maybe just part of the clip, not the whole clip. He was in a meeting last year in France. These same, meetings, high-level meetings that you have, Africa, EU, Africa, whatever, blah, blah, blah. So in this meeting, he was...
maybe...
Rendez-vous est pris pour l'Amazonie. J'ai peut-être donné la parole à Cyril Ramaphosa avant de conclure.
Thank you very much, President Macron. Let me start off by saying, President Lula, don't worry, when we have the BRICS meeting, the issue of currency is top on the agenda, so we are going to discuss it. President Macron, I just want to start off on a very positive note in terms of what I think is evolving here. I think there is consensus that is clearly embraced by everyone that we need to address climate and poverty because they go together, there's a nexus. And as it were, we need to burn the candle on both sides. So that's important, so that's agreed. And we all recognize and accept that we need capital at scale to address the key challenges that many countries in the world face, particularly the developing economy countries. And we also would be agreed that there needs to be more cooperation and coordination between your development banks, multilateral development banks, and the private sector. There needs to be coordination so that there is no fragmentation, which you kept talking about. But I think what is important to many of us is that there should be solid consensus on the reform of the financial architecture of the world. Because without that reform, the dreams and the objectives that we have to address our challenges will not be realized. And those reforms need to touch on a whole range of issues. Mr. Mo Ibrahim yesterday even spoke about something that we may think is insignificant, that the boards of directors of your multilateral institutions are not made up of independent directors. They're largely internal people or shareholders. So that in itself, for us, it's an important reform. We also need to look at the distribution of the special drawing rights. I find it a bit difficult to be told that this is set in the rules and it will forever be like that, and that it's either you get 0 or you get 34 billion. In our view, this is not a zero-sum game. It's a game where we all need to be dealt with equity in an equitable manner. And there is a need for reform in that regard as well. And The other important thing for this to happen, it will help us not to participate as unequal cousins in these institutions. It will help us to participate fully, and so that we don't have a sense that we are beggars, that we are being dealt with out of generosity. I think it's important in the new era that the world is in now, that there should be a good measure of equality among sovereign nations. You know, recently, 7 African countries decided to go and put a call for peace to Ukraine and to Russia. And we raised a number of issues. Zambia was represented, Comoros was represented, Republic of Congo was represented, Senegal was represented, Uganda, as well as South Africa. So we were all represented, and Egypt as well. So we were all at one, that even as we were going to address an issue of the war which has had a negative impact on the African continent, which is the rise in prices for food, rise in prices for fertilizers, we were clear that we are not going there as beggars. We are not going to ask for a favor to both Ukraine and Russia. We were going there to say, open up the Black Sea Channel so that the grains and the fertilizers should go into the world market. So we were not on a begging mission, even as we are in great need as a continent and all that. That should go to demonstrate that Africa should never be seen as a continent that needs generosity. We want to be treated as equals. Even in the multilateral institutions, we want to be treated as equals. And if our equity is at a low ebb, there must be ways in which that can be addressed. To us, this is very important. Our sovereignty is one of the things that we hold on dearly to. And we demonstrated that very clearly to both President Zelensky and to President Putin when it came to this issue. Even as there were suggestions that, yes, we can donate this, we can donate that, we said, we want you to release these grains and fertilizers to the world market so that the world can trade in these commodities and other issues we can handle in a different way. I wanted to make that point so that it should be understood where Africa has evolved up to. We want to be key players on the world stage, want to be key players even in the financial markets and in the MDBs. Now, these are the positive things. I do, Mr. President Macron, want us to address another issue which to us is a bit of a negative. You will have heard President Sisi talking about the 100 billion that was promised in Paris. President Sassou Nguesso yesterday as well also spoke about it at the dinner. Now there is that issue that a number of the commitments that have been made have not really been fully lived up to. But before I get into details, let me immediately say that we recognize the many initiatives that have been put on the table, and a number of countries here have done so. Germany has gone out of the way to put a number of initiatives, and the US has also done a number of things. But there have been times when we felt like we were beggars. I played a key role as chair of the African Union during the COVID period. We felt like we were beggars when it came to vaccine availability, when we felt we needed access to vaccines, and the Northern hemisphere countries had bought all the vaccines in the world and they were hogging them. And they didn't want to release them at the time when we needed them most. And we felt like we were begging. And at times it felt like they would just be droppings from the table. That yes, we will give you that and that. And let me tell you something that generated a lot of resentment. We resented that, and it got worse when we said we want to manufacture our own vaccines. And when we went to the WTO, there was a lot of resistance, enormous resistance. And we kept saying, what is more important, life or profits by your big pharmaceutical companies? And that too, I must tell you now, generated and deepened that disappointment and resentment on our part, because we felt like life in the Northern Hemisphere is much more important than life in the global South. And
rendez-vous est pris.
He goes on and says a number of things with that regard. But I hope you get at least a sense of the feeling of, that's a politician, it's the president of South Africa, so it's not me. That's the feeling towards Europe. But I also want to show a clip of the Minister of...
Pour l'Amazonie, j'ai peut-être donné la parole à Cyril.
Yes, so this is the Minister of Energy. So I'm sure you know climate. Do you accept that there's climate change? Do you accept? Because I know there are people who say there's no climate change.
Not in this room, I guess.
You agree, right? Yes. Okay. Okay, so this is the Minister of Energy in South Africa. Just as a disclaimer, South Africa has one of the best energy transition strategies in the world, not in Africa, in the world. If you want, it's available on the Ministry of Energy, you can find it. But this is the Minister of Energy. So what happens in Africa is that every year, the Ministers of Energy, Ministers of Mine, they meet for what they call an energy summit. It's in the local language, it's called Energy Indal. So this is the Minister of Energy of South Africa. He was hosting last year, and listen to what he said in relation to the EU.
I must, in conclusion, remind ourselves that the European Union take a resolution on Uganda that Uganda must not develop its own oil deposits. But it's not Uganda, it's Europe that takes that resolution and impose that on Uganda. It's the same with the resolution that we must not touch coal. It's not our resolution, it's a resolution of developed economies. Agents are here to tell us that, and we must resist it with everything we have. That we are a continent, we have a responsibility, we must develop our continent to the best of our ability. If we want to do away with load shedding, one, we must improve the electricity availability factor, power station by power station. Two, we must accelerate acquisition of emergency energy. Three, we must import energy from neighboring countries as well interconnected, and we must focus on scales. That is what we should be focusing on, not on walking away from coal. Coal is going to be with us for a very long time, so those who see it as corruption or a road to whatever, they are going to be disappointed for many, many years, because coal is going to outlive many of us. Thank you very much.
Okay, so that's the Minister of Energy, and maybe just a bit of the aggression. So these are protesters here. I just want to know, in Europe, when in Italy, when a minister is speaking, do you allow this to happen? Is it allowed? So what I see, most of the news clips is like you bring in security and you push them out. So that just gives you a hint in the practice of democracy. Okay, so we say African countries are not democratic, but we allow this. Actually, if you watch the whole clip, one of the security details of this man, when these people came on the stage, he went to try and stop them. Then he said, no, leave them. We need their voice to be heard as well. And that's how they left them there. So, but we don't know democracy in Africa, so it's fine. The last one I want to show you is yeah, so this one is the vice president. She's currently campaigning to be elected as president of the US. Last year she made a tour of a number of African countries. This was in a meeting with they had a press briefing with the Ghanaian president.
Thank you for the question. There may be an obsession in America about the Chinese activities on the continent, but there's no such obsession here. China is one of the many countries with whom Ghana is engaged in the world. Your country is one of them. Virtually all the countries of the world are friends of Ghana, and we have relations in varying degrees of intensity with all of them.
Sorry for that one. Yeah, but anyway, so she visited a number of countries, and they travel with their journalists. When presidents or ministers are moving, they have a group of journalists that they travel with. So this question was asked by one of the American journalists, and the question was asked in each of the countries that she visited during that visit. And what is surprising is that all the presidents in each of those African countries that were visited gave a similar answer to the journalist. So if you are a student, an academic analyst, what will come to mind is the fact that it's not possible that all different presidents of different countries are saying the same thing. It means that behind closed doors, they are singing from the same hymn. Do you get my point? Okay, so when you go to the African Union level, this is what they agree on, to say this is our position in relation to either Europe or the US or the countries of the so-called global north. Okay, so just two quick points that I want to make from
It is blocked apparently.
Thank you for...
Yeah, so just two quick observations that I would like to make from the clips that I played. So the first of all is that the African leaders, they do appreciate the relationship that exists between the European Union and the African Union. I mean, like the president did say, that we acknowledge, we appreciate the engagements that we have with the African, the European countries. But at the same time, there is a sense in which they seem to be singing from the same hymn book, as I said, but also the African leaders don't like the way that European leaders treat them. And actually, it's not me. You heard, he said we resented the way we were treated. And that's their story. So even if when you see them on a platform saying, oh, we have good bilateral relations, we have blah, 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 at some level, there's a bit of resentment that exists in terms of the way the treatment goes between the two. I thought I should make a note of that. Then lastly, from scholars, the view from scholars, I'll be very quick on this one. When we consider everything that we've said, the scholars, they will say that the way European countries treat African countries is in a patronizing way. Okay, so we can conclude from that, and we even heard from the politician who said they resent the way they were looked at as beggars. But there's a sense in which European countries patronize or try to patronize African countries, and actually some of them are even colonial in the way they treat African countries. So even if colonialism has ended, the attitude remains towards African countries. Then, of course, the trade relations are skewed. If you look at, for example, there's the issue of trade for aid and etc., but still, if you hear, for example, what the president said, they want to start manufacturing, but when they go to the World Trade Organization, which basically deals with issues of trade in whatever issues, there was this resistance and trying to stop African countries, issues of patent, etc., intellectual property, blah, 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 and so on and so forth. Those of you that are studying international trade will probably know what I'm talking about. So there's trying to block African countries from developing certain capabilities in that sense. Then also the projection of African migration and the treatment of African migrants. You are on the Mediterranean Sea. I don't know if you go there physically or if you see what is, I'm sure you see what happens there. I mean, very inhuman. And currently, maybe I shouldn't say this because I'm in Europe, I might get arrested. But anyway, the double standards that I talked about, so the scholars will say that the way African migration is projected is a security issue. Africans are flooding Europe, they are posing a threat to European countries, and so on and so forth, which may not be the case. So based on these three issues, scholars will argue that decolonization of Africa never represented a significant break from the past. This is the Johnson that I referred to. He's a Norwegian guy. So basically arguing that even if political liberation was obtained with the end of colonialism, the actual linkages between Africa and Europe still remain colonial, in the sense that there's still the domination of one over another. Okay, and actually, there are some literature which will say that the EU's offer of common market for African products was an efficient counter-reaction to Pan-Africanism, and it aims to ensure continued access to African resources for Europe. So basically, even if you are offering concession, there are conditions that are coming in those concessions, and the aim mainly is to maintain dominance and also maintain access to the resources that are on the African continent. And then at a social political level, the EU relegates Africa to the subaltern. So African people are dehumanized in the sense of being considered below the line of the human as non-humans or subhumans. Then I'll explain that a bit later. Then the humanity of the people who Europeans place in this category, so the category of non-humans or subhumans. The humanity of the people who Europeans place in this category is not recognized. They consider them to be without norms of rights or civility, and acts of violence, rape, and appropriation are permitted among them. This is a professor at MIT. He writes a lot on these issues. And basically, to explain, what he argues is that when you look at the world, there historically has been a campaign by European countries, North American countries, to categorize people or human beings, to place them in hierarchies. So there are people that are of a higher hierarchy and people that are of a lesser hierarchy. And there's a line that separates the two groups. So it's the line of being. So the people that are better or are civilized, where norms are observed, they belong to a zone that is called the zone of being. Then the rest, the sub, remember what I said about sub-Saharan, the sub, they belong to the zone of non-being, which is below the abyss or line that is drawn. So this is where you find people that are subhuman. Their norms may not be followed, whatever was said in that. So there is this categorization. Then this categorization of humans is also linked to race. So the white race belongs to the zone of being, and the black race belongs to the zone of non-being. That's the categorization or hierarchization of people in that sense. You can read more about it. He's not the only one. There are a lot of even Africans. This one is Latin American, by the way, but there are a lot of African scholars who write on this. But basically, that's the view from scholars in respect to the relationship between Africa and Europe. And then, of course, lastly, I did make a bit of a hint to say, I want to talk about this. I think we have run out of time. There's a lot to say, but just to say that if you follow the news, you've seen that recently in that the Sahel region, countries in that region have been kind of chasing away the European countries. I don't know if you follow this. So there was a coup d'etat in Mali. There was a coup d'etat in Burkina Faso. There was a coup d'etat in Niger. And then, even with coup d'etats, after that, the new leaders, the military juntas, they chased away the French, saying, please get out. Not only the military that was doing that, remember what I was saying about that line, fighting terrorism, not only the military, but also the diplomats in those countries. An interesting case is, I think it's in Niger, when they were ordinary people, got on the tankers and went to the French embassy, demanding that the French should leave the country. So the question for me is that despite terrorism in the region, why would people, civil society and religious leaders organize a sitting protest at the military airbase after a military coup to remove French troops from Niger? So why would that? You are in a country, there's a military coup. So instead of protesting against the military coup, you join with the military and then you say you should remove. So that's the question for me. And actually, so you find people that there's an increase in insecurity or is worsened by French troops in the region, and Niger is not the only example. So I've mentioned some of the countries. So briefly, those are the views and perspectives. I think I'll stop here. In the interest of time, I think I've overshot. Yeah. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so we have 5 minutes. 5 minutes if you have. Yes, this is going to explode this mic. Yes, if you have any questions, comments, and so on, just a few minutes because, yes, please. So the mic is here.
My name is Anna. I'm from Timișoara in Romania. I'm actually a law student, so I don't necessarily have specific poli-sci knowledge in my background, but I wrote down a question regarding human rights. So my question would be, this is the context. I recently read a thesis that stated that there exists some sort of Western hegemony in the field of human rights, meaning that Western countries have this tendency to forcefully export human rights standards and apply them without taking regard to the specific context of the importing countries. I was wondering whether you agree or disagree with this thesis, and if you agree, if you can provide us with some examples in which this sort of exploitation of human rights is occurring in African countries. Thank you.
Other questions? Yes. Please introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Catalina. I'm also from Timișoara. I'm both a law student and an international relations student. But my question is, a lot of countries in the West are, how to say, scared the fact by the fact that African countries tend now to choose to partner with China or Russia, specifically in cases like the military coup that have happened. Also, I know that military or paramilitary Russian groups have helped to get rid of European militaries in these countries. And what is your opinion about this? Is Russia or China a greater danger than the Western European countries? Or is it something that the African communities is in another way? Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much. So we're running out of time. Chris, please.
Okay, yeah, so thank you for the, can you hear me?
This one.
Okay, thank you for the questions. Those are very interesting questions. Again, I'm not giving my opinions, I'm giving what is in the literature. Pizza, you can get me, please. Anyway, to be frank, there is a concept in the literature that is known as norm diffusion. And mostly it is used in relation with the EU and European countries. And basically the EU is projected as a group of countries that tries to project its values or spread its values and norms across the world to other countries. So among the norms and the values that are promoted are issues of human rights, issues of various freedoms, freedom of information, association, etc., etc. So those norms are promoted when the EU is engaging, or the individual European countries and North America are engaging with these other countries. And one of the ways in which they force them on the countries that they engage with is through aid. So they will give them development aid, but the aid is only given on condition that the countries that are receiving the aid reform by adopting the values or the norms that the European countries promote. Okay, so you can find a lot of literature that is written on that. If you just even Google norm diffusion, EU, you'll find a lot of literature that is written on that. And that also speaks to the notion of an apparent increasing interest or affinity between African countries and China, African countries and Russia, or a preference for those countries. The major difference is that when European countries, the US, go in Africa and engage in development work with them, they go with these norms. Basically, they are conditions. We develop with you only if you implement what we are saying. China goes into a country and says, okay, we want to build a road, and this speaks to remember the first category, the people on the ground that I talked about. China goes in and says, we don't care what you do in your country, or we don't want to interfere with your activities, your internal politics. We are just here for a development project. We are here to construct a road. Once we are done with the road, we go away. We do business with you and we go. So, as a result of that, I mean, if you look at values like freedom of speech, they are not tangible. If you look at democracy, you can't touch democracy. You see what I mean? But if you look at a road, you can point at a road and say, we've built a road for you. So that's one major difference. People on the ground, they will come and say, if you go, I mean, I do my own research, I go doing data collection. When I start asking these questions, they will say, oh, the Europeans, they come to teach us and preach to us about democracy, freedom of speech. Can we eat democracy? The Chinese put that clinic for us. And that's the end of the story. I hope I've answered your question.
Okay. Okay, so, yes, our time is over, Chris. So thank you very much. Thank you very much.